Hello, my name is Victor Fordham, and this is my first discussion board post for our course on historical professions at Liberty University. This week we were supposed to take a look at a couple of dissertations on a topic of our interest, and I have a particular interest in the life and the legacy of Andrew Jackson, so I looked at a couple of dissertations on him. The first one was a PhD thesis called Politics and Personality, the Development of the Counter-Image of Andrew Jackson by John Lawrence Sullivan of Indiana University, written in 1970. The majority of his sources are newspapers, such as the New York Mercury from 1830 and the Cincinnati Daily Gazette in 1836. There are magazines, such as an article from the New York Magazine in 1834, numerous personal letters from Jackson and his contemporaries, personal diaries, such as the diary of Philip Horn, who lived from 1828 to 1851, and political pamphlets, which were the name of the game in terms of politics at that time. Politicians didn't really stump at that time, according to Sullivan. They sort of stayed at home and let others do their dirty work for them, and a lot of that was done in pamphlets. So he relies heavily on those. He consults government documents and even an atlas, so he consults very few secondary sources like books. Most of his conclusions are drawn from primary sources. His methodology is that he looks at attempts made by the opponents of Jackson to tarnish his image, and that's pretty much the gist of this dissertation. Sullivan begins his second chapter with an explanation of the partisanship of the time period, and that's the first clue that he gives that how Jackson is remembered may be more myth than reality, and that it's shaped by propaganda. The first step Sullivan takes is to identify what made him so incredibly popular to begin with, and that is where the detractors begin to attack him. And he shows this, that the detractors systematically dismantle his mythical persona by first attacking his civil record that he began with as a politician, mostly from Tennessee, then attacking his military record, then attacking his political legacy as president, and then showing that some people were asserting that he was just a figurehead for other more adept politicians. The content throughout the dissertation is that Sullivan is showing Jackson's legacy is largely mythological, and his supporters utilize image-based politics to create an image in the minds of people for the type of candidate they would desire, such as using things like Old Hickory and the Cincinnatus of the West and the hero of New Orleans. That's what people wanted. They saw him as an instrument of God sent by the Creator. So for anti-Jacksonians, his detractors, it was important to attack all elements in order to debunk that myth. And ultimately, in his conclusion, Sullivan says that the same tactics used to enhance Jackson's image were also used by his detractors to dismantle it. The second dissertation I looked at was a master's thesis from Kenneth A. Vaughn of the University of Texas at Dallas in 2007 called A Study of the Origins and Agents of Andrew Jackson's Lifelong Antipathy for Great Britain. So many of his sources come from people like James Parton, and I recently wrote a historiography on Jackson where I looked at James Parton. Vaughn portrays him as having a very unfavorable view of Jackson, and I disagree with that because after looking at the book, that's not true. He was a eulogist for him, if anything. So I would disagree with that. But he does use Parton. He uses a lot of other primary sources as well, but including a multi-volume collection called The Papers of Andrew Jackson, and he uses other sources I've seen before from people like John Reed, several from Robert V. Ramini, and a popular book from 2005 on Jackson by historian H.W. Brands. So there are a lot of primary sources, but certainly more secondary sources than Sullivan uses. Granted, this is a master's thesis, not a PhD. His methodology is very psychoanalytical. Instead of focusing on what Jackson did, he tries to insist on perceived anti-British prejudice throughout Jackson's life that would explain why he does what he does. And throughout the content of his dissertation, that's what he talks about, whether it be hatred or fear, everything he does, he says, Vaughn says that it's because of the hatred of the British. So as stated, his conclusion is that Anglophobia is the primary influence in Jackson's life. Thank you very much.